Hi, welcome to episode 6 of Triggers in Spiritual Medicine. I am here with Rachel Grant, who is a sex abuse recovery coach. Just to give you a little feedback before we go into what Rachel is here to talk about, we have been started this collaborative project because we started seeing patterns, especially since the pandemic, of all these different things and all this web of that all leads to the same issue, and that is what I used to say epidemic, and I want to now say endemic of unresolved, unaddressed, unhealed trauma that basically shows up in other areas, whether it's in our health, our mental health, our relationships, our jobs, to how we're even reacting and with this pandemic issue, right? So my goal is really to break the unrecognized epidemic of unresolved, unhealed trauma and create sustainable systems for recovery, healing, and empowerment. And that crosses all platforms. So it's like, well, how does that affect racism? How does that affect sexual assault victims? How does it affect domestic violence, homelessness, drug addiction, alcoholism? I can make a list. And if we just look at some of the similarities that root back to this is kind of what we're addressing is there is this interweaving web, and, like in some of the clinical stuff, we say comorbidities, right? Or co-occurrences, right? In different areas. And our mission really is to help others to rediscover their power that lies within and to find the treasure that's buried within the depths of their own shadows and to help them basically become their own superhero. So Rachel, I was reading about you. You are the author of Beyond Surviving and the Final Stage in Recovery from Sex Abuse. And you've been doing this work since 2007, correct?
That's right.
So tell me, what got you down this journey and how did you go from, say, I'm going to become a sex abuse recovery coach?
Right. Yes, a title I made up, by the way. So, thank you so much for having me, Laura, and hello to everybody who's listening today. Thanks for tuning in and being here. And so, just a little bit about me. I grew up in Oklahoma, and that's, in many ways where my story begins. When I was 5 years old, my grandfather came to live with our family. So my mom, my dad, and I, my grandfather, my older sister and brother were much older. So they were pretty much out of the house or on their way out of the house at that point. And when my grandfather moved in, I was so excited because I was like, okay, captive audience, he's all mine. Right. And like, as a little 5-year-old, you just want someone to play with, right? I would like rush home from school and I'd go to his room and we'd like hang out and talk and play and watch TV. And we spent a lot of time out on the front porch swing, watching the world go by. And so for me, my grandfather became just this companion and a friend and a playmate. And that continued on until I was 10 years old, when one day we were sitting out on that front porch swing and he began grabbing my breast. And I remember thinking in that moment, Laura, that he just didn't realize. I mean, I barely had any attachment to my breast at that point. I'm 10 years old, right? So I'm just starting to develop and understand, what's happening with my body. And this is the 80s in Oklahoma. So there's not a lot around sex education or body safety or consent or any of these things. And so feeling uncomfortable though, and trying to kind of move and get away and shift my body, but he grabbed a hold of me and kind of trapped me in that position with him. And this was, a huge turning point in my life, this moment where this trauma begins. And as I, finally broke away from him and, went to my parents' bedroom, and I'm crying and I'm upset and I'm scared and I'm confused. And, the flood of thoughts are immediately coming in my system. Of course, I didn't understand or know any of this at this time, right? My system is in a state of dysregulation now, right? Like I've gone into a freeze state. I'm now coming out of that and I'm shaking and I'm, trying to process all this. And the mind just immediately wants to explain and understand why. Like, why are these things happening to me? And then there's the moment later in the day when I go to dinner and my mom is like, hey, how was your day? What did you do today? and not knowing what to say, not knowing if I could say something, being very confused about that. And so in that moment of lying and saying everything's fine, everything's okay, no big deal, I just, played outside, that separation of self starts, right? There's the person that is showing up. I love how Glennon Doyle describes it. She calls it like her representative, right? I now had a representative, the Rachel that everybody was seeing. And then there was the Rachel that was experiencing sexual trauma on a pretty much daily basis at the hands of my grandfather. When my parents found out what was happening, my mom just happened to catch him in the act one day. And she snatched me away from him, as only a country mama can. And so got me away. And she and my dad moved him out of our home very immediately. And they tried to get me into counseling, and I didn't want to do that, right? I just wanted to pretend that everything was okay.
How old were you when your mom, by the time she
I
found
was like
out?
11 and a half, around that
Okay.
age. Yeah.
You're lucky. You're
Yeah.
lucky
Oh,
because,
I'm hugely lucky. Yeah.
that, well, I'm not saying lucky like mean, but I
No,
mean
I'm
that
lucky that my
there's
parents
so many.
responded in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's
Yeah.
so many, right? That we hear that mom said that I was a liar or that I was a
Yeah.
slut, that I deserve, right? Because we hear these
All
things
of
from
that.
sex abuse survivors, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's
I
very
never
true.
even disclosed how I was, well, attempted sexual abduction at 12 and raped at 15,
Mm,
and how I didn't even talk about it initially the way I do now until my
mhm.
40s,
Right.
because I looked at it as, well, nothing really happened, you
Mm,
know,
sure.
or I must have done something wrong. And so maybe it's my fault, right? So
Exactly
how
that.
did you go? Because this is what we kind of all experience. Like we experience these different things. So how did you go from experiencing that? And yeah, like you said, you didn't want therapy, right? Which a lot of us when we're at that age were like, I don't want that, right?
Right. Yeah, right. I
That's
just want to pretend that everything's
therapy,
okay. So
right?
so yeah, I mean, so then, my life starts to unfold with this trauma that's unresolved, sitting there. And of course it's impacting me as a teenager and as a young adult. I'm depressed, I'm suicidal at times. I have so much rage and anger. There's a lot of confusion about sex and how to be in relationship. And so by the time I go to college, I've decided that I'm okay, everything's okay. But when I started dating this guy, basically he called me out. Is like, there's stuff going on here that you've not addressed, and I can see it, and I know it's impacting our relationship. And so
That's
I
the
did.
gift, right?
Yeah, it was a gift until he became an abusive jerk, but
Yeah.
that I can laugh about it now, but man, it
Right.
was like
Yeah.
this weird dissonance of like help and support, as narcissists do, right? Like they get you to think, like you're the broken one, you're the one who needs all the help. And in one way it was a gift, but in the other hand, like he became just so, shitty. But it did get me into beginning this process of like survivorship, where I'm beginning to understand and talk about what happened, beginning to make some connections. But then 10 years after being in that relationship, we were married for 3 of that. We divorced. And Laura, that for me was really the turning point in my life, because when
Okay.
he was out of the picture, it gave me an opportunity to really reflect on where I was in my life and what I wanted going forward. I'm in my mid to late 20s. And in some, I remember now, like 28, I'm thinking, my life is over. I'm divorced and
Right.
nobody's ever going to want, like all of that. But I also had so much fear, like what's going to happen to me? Like, am I just going to keep repeating these same patterns and feeling this way? And I just had a really strong moment where I recognized that I was pretty sick and tired of just surviving my life. That was no longer enough. I wanted something more. I wanted to live my life. And so, my intention really wasn't to become a coach. I was in the world of education and childcare and nannying and like all these wonderful things. But I decided to really take myself on. And in that process of doing my own healing work, getting my master's in counseling psychology, studying neuroscience, it all started to form into what is now the Beyond Surviving program. And as I was healing and getting like, wow, that actually worked. And oh my gosh, that really changed. And oh man, that thing that I used to struggle with like every single day is no longer there. I then got curious, like, is this going to work for other people? Like, is this just a me thing, or can it translate? And so, yeah, back in 2007, there were some brave women who were my guinea pigs. And, we got together in a room and I started sharing and kind of bringing in my background in education, as a teacher to facilitate and lead, and, understood how to scaffold learning and what to do when, started thinking about that. And so long story short, that's what I do now. It became my career. And I work with people all over the country, all over the world, guiding them through the Beyond Surviving program.
It's so interesting how many of us end up doing the work we do because of a traumatic event.
Yeah.
And that's the hard thing, because we hear this a lot with like rape survivors and child sex abuse, all of these things, right? And where we talk about like forgiveness, right? And I understand like there's like this debacle even on like the idea of like, how do I forgive somebody who hurt me so much, and how that's not really possible for some, right? But then on the others, it's very much so. And but it's not really so much forgiveness of them, it's forgiveness of ourselves, and understanding that, and this is a hard thing, I think, for some. I'm just going to preface this for some, that depending on where you're at in your healing journey, where the gift, it's like, right? Because I always say, if it wasn't for, like, I have a program called Bless Your Junk. Okay. And it's to take all that stuff. And if it wasn't for all that stuff that I actually had to endure, those difficult things, some of those suicidal ideations that maybe we experienced and all that, right? If it wasn't for experiencing and learning how to recover from all that, we wouldn't be doing the gifts and being able to have the tools or the skill sets to help others that have suffered the same.
Yeah.
That's the gift, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the only way that the way that I reframe that for myself in that conversation is that, like, the trauma is the experience, and the gift is my fortitude and my commitment and my resilience and my decision to take care of me, to reclaim my life. And so I don't think,
I love that.
Yeah, right? Like, I'm the
I
gift.
Love that.
I'm the gift. That's just the experience that set it up. And because, what's so important, and one of the reasons why I do the work I do in the way that I do it, is because not everyone has access to the resources they need, or the education that they need, the support, network that's so important to give them the space to do that work. Right.
Yeah.
And so
it's big work, right? It's big work.
Yeah. Right. And so, and I just, in my process, I started to get really fed up with therapy, or at least I'll say the therapist that I was working with. And again, this is based in a particular time and place. But a lot of the messages that I was getting was like, this is a life sentence. You're never going to really be normal. You're going to be dealing with this for the rest of your life. And that just didn't sit well with me. Honestly, I was like, that is BS. That can't be right. And so, making sure that people, first of all, like, can embrace and have access even to like the possibility and the potential, like, this is an injury. This injured you on an emotional, mental, physical level, and we can heal injuries, and it doesn't have to take a lifetime to do. Yeah. And so, like, I just love, like, kind of getting into that with my clients and being able to give them, strategies and tools. Because for me, like, I certainly got very frustrated in therapy when I would be like, so this is what I'm struggling with. This is what's not working in my life. And I, at a certain point, just being asked to reflect on that, or think about that, or consider where that's coming from, stopped being satisfying. And I was like, so what do I actually do about this? And in the models that I, and the therapist I was working with, there would be the classic, well, what do you think? What does your intuition tell you? What do you think? I was like, oh man, like, no. This is not how I want to roll. Like, I'm looking for someone to be a mentor to me, to show me a path, to give me a process. And so as I was developing the Beyond Surviving program, that just really became very core and very central. And really, when we're thinking about, so like our topic of like triggers, right? Understanding the neuroscience of trauma and how abuse impacts the brain, impacts the nervous system, and then how that causes us, to go out into the world and we have trauma responses. And that all of that is just the outcome of abuse. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're too much of a mess. It doesn't mean you're stuck that way forever. It's kind of like, I describe it like if you were walking along or something happened and you broke your leg. Like, first of all, we would know immediately what to do, wouldn't we? Right? Call 911, we get to the hospital, we set the leg, we put a cast on. Like, there are all these beautiful protocols, and we do things in a particular order and a particular steps to make sure that bone can heal, and the bone will heal. We don't break our leg and then go, oh, well, shit, I guess that's just the way it's going to be the rest of my life. Right? I'm just going to walk around with this broken leg. Like, no way. And so while the injury of trauma isn't as visible, in sometimes it is, but as a broken leg, the theory still applies. And so I just love working on that level with my clients and getting to do that.
I think it's challenging because it's nice to see, especially like the last 4 or 5 years, I want to say, where we're starting to get more trauma-informed therapists, more trauma-informed even physicians, because back in the day, they would say, you're just crazy. You're just a hypochondriac. You're this or you're that. Not understanding that trauma doesn't always present itself psychologically. Correct. It sometimes can manifest physically, as in could be like we're talking about sexual trauma, right? It could be in vaginal dryness. It could be in all kinds of weird things that you go, this is just weird, right? Like I would get just like left ovary pain, like, just polycystic ovaries, hemorrhagic uterine bleeding, irregular period. I mean, these are all symptoms, right? True. So, it just goes into that. And so it's nice to see that on one end but the healthcare system still, as we still see today, it's all about patching Band-Aids. It's never about getting down to the root so you can actually reclaim your life, right? So you're not just pacifying with just a little bit of here, and it's just like, no, we need to like clear this crap out so we can be empowered warriors. I mean, I just finished writing my chapter in a book talking about, the title of the book was specifically supposed to be triggering for someone, hopefully in a good way, but it's called Feisty: Dangerously Amazing Women Using Their Voices to Make an Impact. And why they chose those words is because we're not supposed to have a voice. We have been conditioned to be silenced. Yeah. Even after hundreds of years. I mean, one of the recordings that's going to be coming out in February talks about the link between like the burning times of witches and we talked about white women culture because of our backgrounds, right? Like, why don't women support each other? Even survivors, like, why do we do this? Why can't we support each other? Where's the challenge there? Where do all these belief systems really come from? And how much of it goes even into our DNA over hundreds of years of being told you're not allowed to have a voice. You're not, when some of these women, especially if you're talking like Northern European, they were warriors. They fought side by side with swords and spears and everything else, and they led communities, right? Totally. So, and how much of that impacts our belief system in healing. Like, like I'm working with some people with addictions right now, and that's very prevalent. That led them to addiction is sexual abuse. Yeah. Right. Yeah. High correlation. Sure. High correlation. So it's like, but I still see similar things. It's Band-Aid approaches, right? And it's like, well, geez, how do we go there? So how do you know? Like for me, I keep thinking of like in conversations just with people in general, they think, oh, I dealt with that stuff. I my heart disease or my uterine issues have nothing to do with that. How do you know that maybe you are stuck in still survival mode and
Mm-hmm.
maybe don't realize it? Or what are some of the red flags that you may have unresolved sexual abuse or sexual trauma?
Sure. Well, I would
I know that might
say
be a big.
it's a big, I mean, it's a big question, but it's important because for sure, like, when we think about the structure of healing, so we start from the place of denial and dismissal and minimization. So when we have these traumatic experiences, our first reaction and response is usually to go into a place of self-blame, and then into a place of denial and dismissal, that place that I was kind of describing when I was 11 years old. Like, I want to just pretend that everything is okay. And that pretending stage can go on for years or decades, right? So sometimes people coming into the Beyond Surviving community, they're in their 50s, and this is the first time that they're starting to name out loud, this is what happened to me. And so the first thing to really check in, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're, listening through the lens of somebody who's experienced trauma, then you're likely past that stage. Like, you've come into a place of acknowledgement, right? And so, but what we want to look at and think about is, first of all, like, what is your mindset? One of the things that is always first directly impacted by trauma is how we think about ourselves and how we place or see ourselves in the world. And so common behaviors that might be showing up in somebody who's experienced sexual trauma and that trauma is not resolved, well, first of all, just be a lot of reactivity. Like, you may feel like you're on an emotional roller coaster, and you may want to, blame that on like hormones, right? Or, the moon
ADHD.
or Mercury retrograde or ADHD, right? Like all these different things. Like, you'll be tending to look to other answers, right? Maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, right? But so if you notice that you have a lot of emotional irregularities or reactivity, if you have a lot of globalizing thoughts or catastrophizing thoughts, like all men are this or everyone's out to get me, that's usually a sign that there's distress in the system, and you're still very much in a protective, kind of state of mind, because you don't yet feel really actually safe in your body or in the world, because again, that trauma is sitting there unresolved. Patterns like people pleasing, taking care of everybody else. It's very easy to avoid our own shit when we're taking care of everybody else's. So, right.
You call that bypassing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm gonna take care of you, and that will take up all of my time and my energy. And then there won't be any space for me to sit with myself, right. And look at me. The having a hard time with boundaries, struggling in relationships, having a
Or
hard
even
time with
knowing
like
what does a
trust.
healthy boundary look like, right?
Exactly.
Like, what
Right.
does a healthy boundary
Yeah.
like I know when you were talking earlier, it was, like you were kind of confused when it came to the intimacy at one point, right?
Sure.
And so it's like, well, what does a healthy boundary look like? Do you even know what
Yeah.
that looks like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, what's key in order to be able to set boundaries that are aligned, I usually say aligned boundaries rather than healthy, because like what is an aligned boundary for you might not be an aligned boundary for me. And so if we get too judgy about like, this is good, this is bad, then we can start to judge our boundaries. But if we start to think about our boundaries as being, is this aligned with what I'm a yes to and what I'm a no to?
I
Then
love
we're in
that.
alignment. Yeah.
Love that.
But in order to do that, we have to be connected to our own needs and our own wants. And one of the very first things that we learn in the context of trauma is my needs, my wants don't matter. I'm here to be of use and service to somebody else's needs and wants. And so doing that work to shift that framework and shift that mindset and that energy, so that and learning skills and tools and strategies in order to be able to connect in to your own needs is important. And then connecting into your deservingness to have those needs met or respected, right? And then into the communication. So when I think about like what Beyond Surviving has really become, it is certainly one part trauma resolution. So we're looking at those experiences, we're integrating, we're resolving that trauma. And then it's one part how to live your life, right? Like strategies and life skills and tools and communication, because we often miss a lot of those basic pieces because our nervous system is disrupted. or we're
Yeah.
in environments where we're not getting those kinds of models, for these sorts of things. And so
I,
we get to grow up a little bit, even though we're grown up.
yeah, right. I mean, I remember when we were talking on the phone a few weeks ago,
Mm,
and it's like we parallel actually in a lot of similar things, and the challenge, like with like the work I do, and somebody said, you need to be like, just do trauma work. I go, here's the challenge. The majority of people that end up coming for trauma work are coming because they have back pain, that's
mm,
unresolved. They have breast cancer. They have uterine issues. So it's like they're coming for other things and they haven't quite connected the dots that
right.
it's unresolved trauma yet.
Right.
And it's through doing the work with me and building that rapport, they understand. And then we're able to get down and having them trust that the somatic part, the body's trying to tell you
Yes.
that
Yeah.
there's dysregulation here, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I had somebody that came to me once that had a double knee replacement, twice in 1 year. And we linked that issue to their child just had a miscarriage, but I think it triggered something within them
Wow.
that with them where they lost a child.
I see. Yeah.
So, and it like somehow it just showed up in the
In the
knees,
knees.
and and it was just very, you know, trauma in one aspect is actually very fascinating
Oh,
when
it's
we can
hugely right. Yeah.
when we, I mean, it's kind of like sick, I guess, in a way, because it's like, is it or is it not?
Mhm.
Because when we can quiet the mind enough and listen to the body is going to tell us exactly what it needs to heal itself.
Mm.
But we have this, like we said earlier, like
Mm.
we have been conditioned to not speak. We've been conditioned to not be connected to ourselves, to
Yeah.
our bodies, to our minds, to our sovereignty, to our freedom,
Mm.
to be empowered, right? We're supposed to
Yeah.
be of service, right? So, um, and despite what some of the younger women might think that haven't grown up, but there was a time not too long ago, we still needed a co-signer for mortgages. We still needed a co-signer for a bank, and it's not that long ago.
Mhm.
So, and we're
Yeah.
facing with so this whole women's rights thing is also tied into, I find it, this is the parallel, right? The women's rights and having our right and access to all these different things is also tied into why we have these belief systems. Like, why do we, somebody who is raped, like, here's this woman that comes out of a bar, she's bloodied, bruised, torn. Why does society say, what did you do? Why did you
Mhm.
drink? Why did you go to a bar? Why did you wear that skirt? Were you wearing underwear? Instead of saying, geez, who did this to you? I
Yeah.
mean, Brock Turner was caught red-handed raping somebody. And the
Yeah.
judge was more concerned about his future than what he actually did to
Yeah.
somebody.
Don't get me started, Laura. We will
Well,
be
but
here
this
for
is
hours. I feel
right.
you, right? It's
But I
it's
think this
it's
is part of
important.
healing, right? Because part of
Yeah,
healing is also the bystanders. And
of
part of
course.
healing is getting part of, like, what I realize is the part of the work is how do we address the bystanders to get them to understand that they don't know that they're perpetuating this, but they
Yeah.
are. So we could support survivors. We can say, we believe you,
Mm-hmm.
instead of questioning you, or
Yeah.
you have a motive, right?
Right. Right.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, these are very important big topics when we think about patriarchy, when we think about misogyny, when we think about women, the way that women have been positioned in society for a very long time. When we think about the repercussions of something like rape or sexual trauma, the impact that that has on a person's capacity to be autonomous, have self-agency, be vocal, be empowered, financial sovereignty, like all of these things, become impacted. And so it is in many ways a way to keep women in their place. And the thing of it is, like, and so what's important, like when I start to think about that, is the impact of sexual trauma on men. As more and more men are starting to come forward, we're starting to understand that the numbers are very close. to like the occurrence of trauma in women and men, they're almost exactly matched at this point, now that we understand more about what's going on.
Well,
And
because men, they we shame them just as much, if not more so, with the sexual trauma too, and it's like, like women, well, you're a woman, like, but men, like, well, what were you? What else were you, like? So it's like all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then that for me takes it even to a bigger question of just what is happening societally, right? That our sexual repression leads to sexual, sexual misbehavior, misconduct. Like, what role does that play? And just overall, the way that, children are sexualized in over the top ways more and more these days is pretty distressing. And so, we've got a lot of work to do on a societal level to begin, decreasing what's happening out there. And there's so many good, projects that are happening around awareness and prevention. I'm just about to team up with a colleague of mine, Toby Stark, and we're going to be offering a little something called the Empowered Parent. And just like she does beautiful workshops already in like lots of schools, but just bringing that to my community so that we can help people have these conversations. And that's the thing, like these sorts of podcasts, like, can you imagine like 20 years ago, like this didn't even exist, like to come and just have like, let's just talk openly about sexual trauma and what's going on. And
right?
What's your shit? Like, how have you struggled? How have you been messed up? Like that didn't exist. And now there are so many, like there really are so many more platforms. And, I think women are finding their voice and women are coming forward. I think men are starting to be more in that process now too. And this is
for it to end, we need the men involved, right?
Oh, 100%. Right. And I mean, and that's the thing, when we think about perpetrator violence, really, we need to think about generational trauma. Like you were referring to this earlier a little bit, and how people who harm people very seldom, I mean, the percentage of people who are doing that from an outright sociopathic place with like, they don't have any empathy or any, understanding of what they're doing is very, very minimal. Most of the people who are, abusing somebody, it's because they have experienced trauma themselves. This is not an excuse for their behavior. No. This is not letting them off the hook. But we do need to understand that without intervention, things just keep repeating. And,
the constant silencing, I think, is actually perpetuating it, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in the first episode that we did, actually, I have a colleague of mine who does, he calls it men's work. And the first episode was because it was triggered by an event that happened here that caused a big shit stir in the town because they posted on social media, a news agency, a picture of boys with saying car wash, but they put it over their privates to make it look like they were naked. And so I addressed how that was problematic messaging, right? And it was fascinating on some aspects, but it was also interesting to see how many people still defend that. And when we were trying to address was, this is how, if we're teaching boys that this is acceptable behavior, then when it comes to them being intimate with a girl, how is he going to know what is a healthy boundary when she says no? Right? When the stats, I don't know if you saw the stat, this is many, many, many years ago, if I try to remember the stats correctly, but I remember there was a study or questionnaire that they did, I think it was Boston University, where they questioned freshman boys if it was not illegal, and if they could get away with it, how likely were they to, and it was like all these different things towards women, okay, and including raping women, okay, and 60% said they would.
That's a trip. Damn. Yeah.
And I think it was like 60%. So that, what I was trying to bring up, like on that particular podcast, was to think that your son can't, if we don't address boundaries like this one right here and how they're presenting themselves sexually and how adults are going yay at 14, 15 years old and saying that this is okay, then they're not going to know that when a girl says no, or when there's a boundary crossed, they're not going to know what's healthy and what's not.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, man. So yeah, like the place in which, and that we understand that people who have caused harm, it's all that. It's like, what are we doing in the early days? How are we raising boys? How are we raising girls? I mean, I find moments of hope. Like I was a nanny for 8 years with the same family. So when I started, the little girl was 8 months old, could barely sit up, and
Oh,
now she's about to graduate high school.
oh my gosh.
And she's my surrogate baby. She's my surrogate daughter.
Oh,
And when we have conversations about sex and consent, she is so light years ahead of where I am, and she's self-aware. I'm not saying all kids these days are just like her, but it does give me a little bit of hope. Like there's more conversation happening these days, and parents are
that's amazing.
more aware, right? And things are shifting. We have a lot of work still to do, but we've made some progress. And and I think on the side of the work that I'm on, as far as resolution of trauma, right? People accessing resources. One of the things that I love about the work I get to do is having lots of different ways to connect with people. So I have my monthly support group that's completely free. You can make a donation if you want, but if you don't have the resources, you can drop in there once a month and have a safe space to connect and to explore and think about.
Okay, so that's going into, hold on, let me just pause you for 1 second. So we're getting into that. I want to make sure we have a structure for folks. So when we're talking about now the medicine piece, right? So the three things that, because what I'm thinking of is especially folks that go, well, I need the help, but I don't know. So you're talking about possibly one solution right here, right?
Oh yeah.
And so we're going to talk about 3 tips that I want you to offer, like solutions or things that, somebody that might be saying, well, is this really what I need? How would I know this is what I need? What are 3 solutions that could help somebody jumpstart reclaiming their life from sexual abuse?
Yeah.
You start off with one. That's why I wanted to stop you. So
thank you. Jump the gun. Okay, well, I'll actually back up then, because the first thing that I would want anyone to ever do is understand where they are in their healing process. And so a resource that I can offer to support them on that is the 3 stages of recovery checklist. And so if you go to rachelgrantcoaching.com/checklist, you can get this free guide. And in this, you're going to learn about the stages: victim, survivor, what I call beyond surviving, and kind of what the goals are of each of those stages, what you can be expecting in your journey, what kinds of support you're going to want to get based on where you are in that process, because we want the support to be in alignment with where you actually are in your journey. And what's true is you can be in one stage in one area of your life, maybe still dismissing or minimizing something, and then you can be very well resourced in a beyond surviving stage in another area of your life. But the idea is to get an overall picture, because that first assessment is going to help you then figure out what your next steps are. And
gotcha.
Yeah. And so then, for example, the ASCA program, the Adult Survivors of Child Abuse Monthly Support Group. So now this could be a second step. All right. So I know that I want to have some support in beginning to kind of talk about and name and acknowledge, and even just to start, this survivor stage is all about getting very book smart about trauma. It's when you start to do a lot of that reading. And so you can access, resources on my webpage, and you can access that monthly support group, and that can be a great place to start the conversation.
And let me just say something about a support group. Any trauma survivor, and I'm also working again with people with addiction too, there is so much power.
Oh, hell yeah.
To just be part of a group and knowing you're not alone.
Yeah, 100%.
There's so much power, because part of dealing with this or healing from this is feeling isolated and alone, that nobody understands you, and all these things, and to be empowered and have others hold space and lift you up at the same time is so, so important in the process.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so that in tandem, like with my Facebook group, which if you Google healing from sexual abuse in Facebook, you'll probably find it. Like
And
that's
I'll include a link. I'll include a
okay.
link on YouTube as well.
All right, that's fabulous. So yeah, that's like 5,000 people strong. And exactly that. It's another place where you can drop in, you can ask questions. I have an amazing team of comment moderators and volunteers who support people in that community. Of course, I'm in there too, doing trainings and offering resources. And then I think that, if I'm going to add a number 3, what could be number 3? I mean, ultimately, the most important thing that any of us have to do in order to heal from trauma is to make that choice, to make a decision, like enough is enough, which means we have to tap a little bit into hope. We need to find that place in us that says, yeah, maybe things could be different. And we have to take in some ways a little leap of faith. Particularly, I find a lot of the folks who come to me will say things like, gosh, I've tried everything, I've done this and I've done that, I've done this. And like, how's this going to be different? And, and so we talk about that and how the Beyond Surviving program is going to work with the trauma in a very different way. But it's mainly like, don't give up. Even if it's me, if it's somebody else, it's a different resource. Keep choosing you, keep leaning in, stay hopeful, and trust that anything that you're experiencing that's there as a result of trauma, it can be resolved. It can be healed. Sometimes it's a matter of time. Sometimes it's a matter of finding the right mentor, or guide, or resource, but it's all out there and available for the taking.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important. I think this is another thing that goes to our society, right? We have been so conditioned to, I go to doctors, so they fix me. I go to therapists, they fix me. I go to my school and they're going to teach me, right? And I think really what we're learning with trauma is that not only do we have to make a choice and a decision, but we have to take responsibility and have the courage to be able, because healing, when we start healing some of those roots, they're not always peaches and cream and roses.
It can get ugly for a minute. Yeah. Right. For sure.
But what I always say, if I can just leave with one thing, it's like, one of the things I've learned is like when trauma surfaces that has been unresolved, we as survivors have a tendency to do one thing. We go, oh my God, no. And we shove it right back in.
Right back in.
We press it right back, and then it comes right back up. And they go, oh, but I'm doing it. And it's, why do we do that? We let it up and we go, get the fuck out, boom. And it's gone.
Yes, Laura. I love that. Eviction notices. We need to be handing out eviction notices. True.
Because how does that? There's attention shoulders. Sometimes it's just having that one visualization. Does it mean it comes back? It can, because it's that memory, right? That's that cellular memory. What I've learned about triggers is that when we conquer those triggers, they no longer conquer us. And when they surface, we can turn them, instead of them disempowering us, we can now shift it and turn them into a power, right? Like I say, like I have a bad tooth. Like I went to the dentist today, right? And they were looking at me like I had 10 heads because they want to remove something, right? And I said, yes, but if it wasn't for this tooth, whenever X, Y, and Z happens, I would never know about it because it gives me the red flags. Okay.
Special tooth. I love it.
Right? So it's like, whether that's somebody's tooth, whether it's like a heart flutter, whether it's that gurgling in the stomach, or my bowels acted up 2 days because 2 days after you had an emotional whatever. Listen to the body, listen to the triggers, because it's going to show you how to find the medicine and what medicine do you need. That's why I call it spiritual medicine, because even though we deal with physical and mental, emotional, societal, at the end of the day, it's tapping into that self, that spiritual part of ourself as the driving train to know what medicine do we need to become whole again. and
Yeah.
to reclaim that, right?
Hmm. Yeah. And I think this is why, like for me, in the Beyond Surviving program, our entry point, our starting point is very kind of top down. We work kind of cognitively, we work with belief systems, we work with awareness, we work with accessing choice. And then like we want to also have, ways of entering into and working with the trauma through the body. And what I found is like some people, like they really need that first entry point through the mind. Like that's where they feel comfortable, safe, at ease. And then we start to work into the body. Other people, they're already in their bodies so much and they want to work through like the somatic place. And then they need some cognitive work to back that up. And so this beautiful balance, like it's all connected. There's no such thing as I'm only working in the mind or I'm only working in the body. Anytime you're working with yourself, you're working with all of it. It's like, but where are you shining the light, right? Where are you putting more focus? And then how can you work holistically? And I think that's like in the Beyond Surviving world, we build like this toolkit. That's the idea. And in this toolkit, we want to have like different modalities, different tricks, different tools. Like, am I coming at this first through mindfulness, or am I coming this through body awareness, or am I coming it through like a family systems, like an awareness of like what's happening around me? And by doing that, then you have like this robust capacity to, exactly as you say, like things are going to happen in your life. And how can you respond to that, more immediately, more effectively, more efficiently, such that you remain more often than not in your empowered adult here and now self.
Yeah. I always say it's how do we stop? How do we pause? How do we assess? And then how do we process?
Hell yeah. Yeah. That's the ticket.
So thank you so much for being. Could you share how folks could find you?
Yeah, pop over to my website, rachelgrantcoaching.com. You'll find links to resources there, like the group I mentioned, my podcast, the Facebook group, the blog, all these sorts of things. You can also learn more about the Beyond Surviving program. And if you'd like to explore working with me, either through the group program or one-on-one, you can apply for a Discover Your Genuine Self consultation. And you can also get that checklist that I mentioned earlier from the website. So an abundance of resources and opportunities. And for sure, if you're listening and you're vibing with me and what I'm sharing is really connecting and you'd like to learn more, reach out. I'm happy to be here as a resource and support however I can be. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining. It was such a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you.